The snow had stopped falling an hour before dawn, leaving the forest outside Kharkov coated in a pale, brittle silence. The temperature hovered below -20, cold enough to freeze exposed skin within seconds. The horizon glowed with a faint, metallic light as the first suggestion of morning bled through the cloud cover. February 6th, 1943. A date that would become etched into memory for every man who survived the assault that followed. The German 4th Panzer Army had regrouped after days of fighting, gathering its infantry and armored elements along a frozen tree line that stretched for nearly 2 kilometers. Their objective was simple, brutal, and uncompromising: retake the ridge overlooking the village of Vasyukovka. Whoever controlled that ridge controlled the road beneath it, a narrow artery that Soviet supply lines depended upon as they pushed west in the wake of the Stalingrad breakout. The ridge was defended by the remnants of a Soviet rifle battalion. Fewer than 100 men remained after weeks of attrition. Their trenches were shallow, their ammunition low, and their fire support non-existent. The Red Army expected a breakthrough somewhere along the front. The soldiers on the ridge knew they were merely buying time. But among them was one man whose presence would alter the course of the German assault: Senior Sergeant Ivan Koval, a sniper from the 1st Guards Rifle Division. He had arrived during the night, escorted quietly through the forest by a pair of Soviet scouts. His reputation had preceded him. Over 200 confirmed kills, mastery of the Mosin, Nagant model 1891-30 with PU scope, an ability to disappear into terrain as though the land itself concealed him. Now, as the first light reached the snow-covered ridge, Koval lay motionless beneath a fallen pine tree, its branches covered in frost. His face was wrapped in a white scarf, his rifle positioned across a natural crease in the ground. He had not slept. He had barely moved. He listened to the creaking of frozen bark, to the distant rumble of engines, to the rhythmic crunch of boots crushing ice beneath heavy strides. The German assault began with artillery. Shells landed along the ridge in measured intervals, sending fountains of snow and earth into the air. The explosions were muffled by the density of the frost, producing dull, concussive booms that rolled through the forest like distant thunder. Soviet soldiers huddled in their shallow trenches as the bombardment intensified. Koval did not retreat. He adjusted his position slightly, pulling the rifle stock tighter into his shoulder. His breath formed a pale cloud that lingered momentarily before vanishing. Through the PU scope, the world appeared as a narrow corridor of white and gray. A branch shifted in the wind. Snowflakes drifted across the lens. His gloved hand brushed them away without disturbing the rifle. As the shells ceased, the German infantry advanced. They emerged from the tree line in disciplined formation, dark shapes against the white expanse, their winter camouflage draped across shoulders and helmets. Behind them, a Panzer III rolled forward with its engine growling, turret rotating slowly as it sought targets on the ridge. Machine gun teams followed at its flanks, their MG-34s mounted on bipods, barrels covered to prevent ice formation. The Soviet defenders watched silently. They knew they were outnumbered 5-1. Their machine guns were iced, their rifles worn. Their commander had been killed the previous evening by shrapnel. Yet they remained. There was nowhere to retreat. No reserves, no reinforcements. Only the ridge, the snow, and the man lying alone beneath the pine tree. Koval chose his first target. A German squad leader carrying binoculars advanced toward a shallow depression in the snow, raising his hand to signal the next movement. Koval exhaled softly. The crosshair steadied. The shot cracked through the air with a sharp, dry snap unique to high-velocity rounds in freezing temperatures. The German soldier fell instantly. The squad halted. Uncertainty rippled down their line. Another man dropped to his knees, scanning the ridge. Koval reloaded with practiced fluidity. His second shot struck a machine gunner attempting to set up his MG-34. Smoke erupted around the falling body. The assistant gunner froze in place, unsure whether to drag the weapon to safety or take cover. Koval fired again, and the assistant collapsed beside the gun. The German infantry faltered. Their formation dissolved into scattered shapes, seeking concealment behind shallow snowdrifts. The Panzer III increased its speed, attempting to push forward and suppress the ridge with its coaxial machine gun. Its tracks flung frozen earth into the air. Koval shifted his position, dragging the rifle across the frost in a slow, deliberate arc. His next shot pierced the exposed face of the Panzer's turret commander, visible only for a second as he leaned out to survey the battlefield. The commander slumped inside the open hatch, helmet falling into the snow below. The tank stopped abruptly. Its turret rotated halfway before freezing in place. Deprived of leadership, the crew hesitated. Koval watched through the scope, waiting. A hatch opened slightly as a gunner attempted to take command. Koval's shot struck the rim of the hatch, ricocheting into the gunner's shoulder. The hatch slammed shut. The Soviet rifleman, stunned by the precision, began firing in support. But it was Koval's shots that dictated the flow of the battle. Each crack of his Mosin, Nagant sent another German soldier to the ground. Attempted flanking maneuvers stalled. The machine gun teams shifted positions only to be cut down moments later. A German platoon leader ordered smoke grenades. Dark plumes rose into the sky, drifting sluggishly in the icy air. Koval waited for the wind to thin the smoke. When it did, he resumed firing. 50 meters behind the Panzer III, a new threat appeared. A second wave of German infantry pushing through the treeline, supported by a Sturmgeschütz III. The assault gun's low silhouette moved steadily across the snow, its 75mm gun pointed toward the ridge. Its armor was thick. Its presence meant the assault would intensify. Koval adjusted his rifle again. His hands remained steady despite the cold. He targeted the infantry first, choosing officers, radio men, and machine gunners with ruthless efficiency. Each shot disrupted command, communication, or firepower. The Germans, unable to determine his position, fired blindly at the ridge, sending bullets cracking across branches and splintering bark. Soviet riflemen watched as the German line repeatedly froze under the weight of a single sniper's accuracy. They had expected to die that morning. Now, for the first time, hope flickered among them. Some clutched their weapons with renewed determination. Others shouted to one another, emboldened by the sudden shift in momentum. But the battle remained far from decided. A group of German pioneers advanced with flamethrowers strapped to their backs, their faces hidden behind protective masks. They intended to burn the ridge clean of defenders. The Sturmgeschütz III continued forward, its gun lowering toward a Soviet trench. Its tracks churned through the thick snow, leaving deep black scars across the frozen earth. Koval watched the assault gun through his scope. He could not kill the crew with rifle fire, but he could blind them. He steadied his aim upon the vehicle's periscope slit, a target barely 3 centimeters tall. The crosshair trembled slightly as snowflakes drifted across the lens. He waited until the moment felt right. He fired. The round struck the edge of the periscope, shattering it. The gunner recoiled inside the compartment, startled by the unexpected blast. The assault gun halted, its advance suddenly uncertain. German pioneers, now exposed in the open, crouched behind the stalled vehicle. Their flamethrowers glinted faintly beneath the gray light. Koval targeted the nearest one, aiming at the cylindrical fuel tank strapped to his back. The shot pierced the tank. The explosion that followed was violent and immediate. A burst of fire engulfed the surrounding snow, sending the other pioneers scrambling backward. Flames leaped skyward like a living creature, casting harsh shadows across the battlefield. The sight halted the German assault entirely. The Sturmgeschütz 3 reversed abruptly, its tracks squealing against the frozen ground. German infantry, near the tree line, ducked behind fallen logs, pinned by the relentless precision of a rifle they could not see. Then across the fields, another group of soldiers witnessed the impossible. A U.S. Army reconnaissance patrol, operating under liaison orders with Soviet forces, had been observing the ridge from a distant vantage point. They had expected to find retreating Soviet infantry or advancing German armor. Instead, they saw a single sniper halting an entire German assault. Through their binoculars, the Americans watched the battle unfold, watched the German infantry fall back, watched the armored vehicle stall, watched the lone Soviet rifleman lying unmoving beneath the pine tree as though carved from frost itself. They had seen sharpshooters before, but they had never seen this. Koval reloaded again, his breath steady. The battlefield lay before him like a frozen tableau of chaos. Burning snow, stalled armor, scattered infantry, drifting smoke. He remained where he was, silent, cold, imperceptible. The assault had not ended, but the moment had shifted, and the Germans sensed it. The ridge overlooking Vasyukovka had not always been a battlefield. Before the war, it was a quiet stretch of farmland, dotted with birch trees and small, weather-beaten cottages. The road below, it was used by villagers driving wagons of grain toward Kharkov. Children walked it on their way to school. Shepherds guided their flocks across its steady incline. Nothing about the ridge suggested that one day it would become a strategic point worth dying for. Yet by early 1943, the entire region had transformed into a vast, shifting front line. Snow-covered fields stretched out like white scars across a landscape torn by encirclements, counterattacks, and exhausted armies. After the collapse of German positions at Stalingrad, the Red Army was pushing west with new momentum, reclaiming territories lost during the disastrous summer of 1941. But success came with cost, and Soviet lines were thin, overstretched, and fragile. High command sought to exploit the German disarray, but logistics strained under the weight of rapid movement. Fuel shortages, ammunition deficits, and frozen supply routes plagued every advance. What remained of the Soviet 1st Guards Rifle Division had been diverted to reinforce the Kharkov sector, an area both armies understood was critical for the next phase of the war. Kharkov, a major rail hub and industrial center, sat like a hinge between the southern and central fronts. If the Red Army could control it, they would secure a gateway for future offensives. If the Germans could retake it, they would stabilize their collapsing front and regain strategic initiative. Thus, the ridge above Vasyukovka became essential, not because of its size, but because of its height, its view of the road, and its ability to anchor defensive lines against German counterattacks. The remnants of the Soviet Rifle Battalion holding the ridge had suffered brutally during the previous days. Their trenches were crude, carved mostly with entrenching tools and frozen hands. Their uniforms were threadbare from constant wear. Many had wrapped their feet in cloth scavenged from captured supply crates to fend off frostbite. But they stayed. Orders were explicit. Retreat was not an option. The men were exhausted, but they were also hardened. They had survived retreat from Belgorod, survived encirclement attempts, survived nights of artillery shaking the earth beneath them. Yet for all their resilience, they lacked something vital: precision fire. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed infantry and concentrated artillery, but the chaotic retreat of German forces had made coordinating support impossible. Ammunition remained limited. Mortars had frozen firing mechanisms. Machine guns had jammed repeatedly during the night. That was why the arrival of Senior Sergeant Ivan Koval carried such weight. Koval's presence on the ridge was not a coincidence. Soviet intelligence had reported a German armored regrouping south of Vasyukovka, including the 320th Infantry Division supported by elements of the 6th Panzer Division. Their goal was clear: break through the scattered Soviet lines, retake the high ground, and threaten the Soviet advance toward Kharkov. If they succeeded, the momentum gained after Stalingrad would falter. A successful German counterstrike could unravel entire Soviet formations. Koval had been reassigned from division headquarters with urgent orders: hold the ridge as long as possible. His reputation had traveled far beyond his unit. Fellow soldiers spoke of him not with boastfulness, but with quiet respect. He moved silently. He shot only when certain. He never wasted a round. His ability to read terrain bordered on instinct. In a war where millions fought and died, snipers were rare craftsmen, shaping the battlefield one shot at a time. Koval had fought at Tula during the desperate winter of 1941, defending factories against German infantry who believed the city was theirs for the taking. He had stalked officers through the forests of Bryansk, eliminating small command groups that threatened Soviet defensive lines. He had once remained motionless for 18 hours in a snowfield outside Mozhaisk, waiting for a single high-value target. His patience was legendary, his discipline unbreakable. Yet even for him, the ridge at Vasyukovka carried a weight he had not expected. The German counterattack had momentum behind it. Their preparation had been meticulous. Their infantry had regrouped despite winter's brutality. Their armored units had been refitted after the chaos at Stalingrad. The assault on the ridge was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated strike to claw back the initiative. The Soviets knew this. That is why they sent him. But Koval did not fight alone. Among the Soviet defenders was Lieutenant Andrei Vasilyev, a young officer whose leadership had been forged by attrition rather than training. He had been promoted 3 times in 6 months as each predecessor fell. His face bore the imprint of sleepless nights and unrelenting pressure. Yet he maintained a calm, steady presence among his men. His voice guided them when chaos threatened to break their resolve. Next to him stood Corporal Dmitry Sokolov, a former machinist from Rostov who had learned to fire a rifle with quiet precision. Private Sergei Petrov, barely 19, clutched his weapon with trembling hands but never vacated his position. The rest of the platoon consisted of men drawn from across Ukraine, Russia, and Siberia. Factory workers, farmers, mine laborers, now united by necessity in the snow-covered trenches. Their ammunition was scarce, their rations nearly gone, but their discipline held. On the German side, the situation was no less urgent. The collapse in the south had threatened the stability of the entire Eastern Front. General Erhard Raus, one of the Wehrmacht's most respected commanders, had ordered the counterattack near Kharkov to exploit a widening gap in the Soviet lines. His goal was decisive: break the Soviet spearhead, isolate their forward units, and regain the momentum lost after the encirclement at Stalingrad. The German units assigned to retake the ridge were experienced. Many had fought in the summer offensives against Voronezh and had endured brutal winter conditions for nearly 2 years. Their officers carried maps annotated with precise timings and engagement plans. Their infantry understood the terrain. Their armor crews had drilled for rapid assaults. The Germans attacked with the confidence of soldiers who had executed similar maneuvers countless times. They expected resistance, but nothing extraordinary. They believed the Soviet defenders were spent remnants, weakened by weeks of fighting. Intelligence suggested no heavy weapons on the ridge, no artillery support, no reinforcements. The assault should have been straightforward. But one factor remained unknown to the German command: the presence of a sniper capable of altering the pace and direction of battle through precision alone. A single marksman could delay a platoon. A skilled marksman could slow a company. But a sniper of Koval's caliber, capable of targeting officers, disabling armored vehicles, and controlling the battlefield from concealed positions, could halt an entire assault. This was the nature of sniping in the Second World War: unseen influence. One man shaping engagements far beyond his size or rank. On the morning of February 6th, as the first artillery shells struck the ridge, German infantry believed they faced only weakened Soviet riflemen. Their advance followed established doctrine: coordinated fire, disciplined movement, and armored support. Yet their expectations crumbled with each shot from Koval's rifle. The Americans who observed from the distant tree line came from the 350th Infantry Regiment's Reconnaissance Detachment, sent forward as part of liaison efforts between Allied and Soviet forces. Their role was limited: monitor the front, gather intelligence, and report on German movements. They had not expected to witness a battle of such intensity. From their vantage point, they recorded the German advance through the snow. They noted the armored vehicles, the coordinated spacing, the steady timing of artillery. All textbook Wehrmacht procedure. But when the firing began, the rhythm changed. One after another, German infantry fell. Machine gun teams collapsed before reaching firing position. Officers dropped mid-step. Armored vehicles stalled. Smoke plumes rose from ruptured tanks. The battlefield's tempo shifted from organized assault to disorganized confusion, all caused by the steady cadence of a rifle fired from somewhere invisible beneath a frost-covered pine. In their reports, the Americans would later describe the scene as a single rifleman creating the effect of an entire company. To the Soviet soldiers on the ridge, Koval's presence meant survival. Each shot he fired bought them time. Seconds that allowed them to reposition, minutes that prevented German breakthroughs, hours that kept the ridge out of enemy hands. But there was more at stake than they knew. Hours earlier, far behind the front lines, Soviet command had received intelligence that the Germans planned to commit additional armored reserves if the ridge fell. If the assault succeeded, a domino effect could begin. Soviet spearheads isolated, forward brigades encircled, and the Kharkov offensive delayed or reversed. This ridge was a hinge upon which an entire sector of the front might turn. Koval understood this instinctively. He had seen battles swing on small details: the position of a machine gun nest, the fall of an officer, the momentary panicked retreat of an infantry section. He knew the Germans relied on momentum. Remove that momentum, and the assault would falter. The stakes of the battle stretched far beyond the snow-covered pine that hid him. If he succeeded, Soviet forces would hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, stabilizing the advance. If he failed, the ridge would fall, and with it, perhaps the chance to reclaim Kharkov. In the biting cold of that February morning, surrounded by snow, smoke, and the distant thunder of armored engines, the battle for the ridge became more than a tactical confrontation. It became a contest of endurance, a duel between momentum and precision, a struggle defined not by numbers, but by one man's ability to shape the course of an assault through sheer will and skill. The Germans advanced with confidence. The Soviets defended with desperation. And in the space between them, a sniper waited, calm, patient, and unshakable. The stakes had never been higher. The first phase of a German assault unfolded with mechanical precision. Their infantry advanced in staggered waves, spread across the open field like dark shapes moving through snow. Their equipment clattered softly beneath the steady thunder of distant artillery. Panzer IVs rumbled behind them, engines growling, treads grinding frozen earth beneath steel. From a distance, the assault resembled a slow-moving tide, methodical, confident, inevitable. But as the first German platoon neared the base of the ridge, something unusual happened. Their momentum faltered, not because of Soviet fire, which had yet to begin, but because a single man had taken aim from a frozen pine overlooking the battlefield. Koval lay prone on a bed of snow, his breath slow, controlled, dissipating as faint mist before the cold swallowed it. He blended seamlessly into the terrain. A padded winter jacket covered in frost. A white hood pulled low. Branches arranged with careful precision. Nothing about him drew attention, not even movement. Only his eyes remained exposed, focused, calculating, unblinking. He observed the Germans through the scope of his Mosin, Nagant M91/30, fitted with a PU telescopic sight. The rifle rested on a small mound of packed snow. The barrel remained steady despite icy wind curling along the ridge. Koval noted distances, angles, and wind direction with silent clarity. Years of experience had trained his judgment to near instinct. He scanned the German formation. He identified commanding figures first, the men whose presence shaped the speed and cohesion of an entire company. His breathing slowed further. Then he fired. The first shot traveled across the frozen air with a sharp crack. It struck a German lieutenant at the front of the formation, sending him collapsing into the snow without a sound. Confusion rippled through the platoon. The formation halted. Men crouched. Some looked back, uncertain where the threat had originated. Before they could reorganize, Koval fired again. A machine gun assistant fell backward, his weapon tumbling from numb fingers. A third shot followed, striking a radio man carrying a field set across his shoulder. Each shot appeared from nowhere, precise, deliberate, devastating. The Germans responded with instinct rather than direction. They dropped to the ground and scanned the tree line on the ridge, firing sporadically toward what they assumed was an entrenched Soviet line. But none of their shots came close. Their volleys struck bark, branches, open air, anywhere but the carefully chosen nest in which Koval waited. The Soviet infantry behind the ridge, hearing the first volleys, tightened their grips on their rifles. They glanced toward Koval's position, though they could not see him. They could only hear the effect of his presence. Measured shots interrupting the German advance like a metronome of destruction. Lieutenant Vasyukovka, crouched behind a snow-covered berm, tracked the German formations through binoculars. Every hit from Koval shifted the battlefield's rhythm. The German advance weakened each time an officer fell, each time a machine gun failed to deploy, each time a messenger dropped before relaying orders. What should have been a rapid, overwhelming push up the ridge dissolved in a stalled confusion. This was the sniper's influence. This was the unseen hand shaping battle. The German infantry regrouped. Officers shouted commands. Platoon leaders used hand signals to direct movement. Machine gun teams worked to reposition themselves. They attempted to form a firing line. Koval adjusted his scope. He exhaled. A fourth man fell. Then a fifth. The Germans then shifted tactics. They called forward a half-track armed with a mounted MG-34. Its engine roared as it lurched across the snowy field, spraying a hail of bullets toward the ridge. Snow and dirt erupted along the crest. Trees splintered. The barrage was thick, continuous, punishing. It was designed to suppress, not to hit, but to intimidate. The Soviet riflemen ducked into their trenches, bracing as rounds tore past them. Some covered their helmets with gloved hands. The air filled with metallic whines as ricochets sliced overhead. But Koval did not flinch. He waited for the half-track to swerve slightly, exposing its gunner for a brief moment between bursts. The opportunity lasted less than a second. He fired once. The MG-34 went silent. The gunner slumped over the weapon mount. The half-track veered, its driver panicking, and the vehicle skidded sideways in the snow before crashing into a shallow ditch. Without support fire, the German infantry stalled again. The Americans watching from the observation post exchanged glances but remained silent. In their reports, they would later write that the sudden cessation of enemy fire appeared to result from a single, highly disciplined marksman. They were not exaggerating. The battlefield reflected the work of one man controlling the pace of an entire assault. Yet the Germans were resilient. Their discipline and training reasserted itself within minutes. Officers barked new commands. Infantry shifted formation. A second wave advanced, this time taking advantage of depressions in the terrain to avoid a direct line of fire. Their movement became slower but more cautious, controlled steps instead of a determined advance. German doctrine emphasized overcoming obstacles with fire and maneuver. The sniper had become the obstacle. Panzer IV tanks rolled forward, their tracks biting deep into frozen mud. Snow covered their armor, muting their dark outlines against the field. Their cannons aimed towards Soviet trenches. Their coaxial machine guns scanned for targets. To the Germans, armor would break the stalemate. But Koval studied them as well. He had encountered tanks before, had stalked them through forests and destroyed commanders who carelessly opened their hatches. He knew when armored crews felt confident, when they felt vulnerable, and when they relied too heavily on infantry support. Now, their support faltered, and so did their awareness. Koval shifted again, aligning his scope with the lead panzer. The tank commander stood partially exposed, scanning the ridge with binoculars. His silhouette contrasted clearly against the lighter snow. Inexperienced commanders often ducked at the first sign of sniper fire. Experienced commanders, however, sometimes trusted their armor too much. This one trusted it too much. Koval fired. The officer collapsed into the turret. The tank jerked left as the shocked crew inside temporarily lost coordination. The hatch slammed shut. Confusion rippled through the armored column. One of their leaders had vanished in an instant. Behind the lead panzer, a second tank attempted to reposition. Its commander shouted for the infantry to increase their pace. But Koval fired again, striking another officer directing the movement. German infantry dropped into cover, but Koval shifted with fluid precision, eliminating a machine gun team attempting to set up a firing position behind a wrecked tree. Each shot carried weight beyond the single target. Each hit disrupted movement. Each disruption compounded confusion. The Germans now faced a dilemma familiar to any army encountering a master sniper. They could not advance quickly, they could not take cover effectively, and they could not target the threat. The battlefield had turned into a maze of hesitation. Lieutenant Vasyukovka recognized the shift immediately. He signaled his men to conserve ammunition. They did not need to fire yet. Koval was doing the work of an entire platoon. Their task was simple: remain ready. The Americans, observing the ridge, recorded events with increasing astonishment. They had expected a Soviet defense built on massed rifle fire and aggressive counterattacks. Instead, they witnessed a precisely conducted defensive effort shaped around the work of a single marksman whose influence extended far beyond his solitary nest. The German assault resumed in the late morning, reinforced by additional infantry companies. This next wave approached with greater caution, spreading wider, staying low, moving slowly. They attempted to confuse the sniper with multiple targets. They advanced with methodical discipline. But discipline could not overcome terrain. The open field left them exposed. Koval's vantage point allowed him to see nearly every movement. He selected targets not for numbers, but for impact. Officers, radio operators, machine gun carriers, observers. Removing those men did more than reduce German strength. It dismantled their ability to coordinate. The Germans responded with mortar fire. Shells exploded along the ridge, shaking the earth. Snow plumes shot into the air. Splinters of bark rained down on Soviet trenches. Men curled tightly beneath their overcoats as explosions thundered overhead. Koval waited. He did not move. Mortar fire was designed to force snipers to relocate, revealing themselves. Koval had learned that lesson on the outskirts of Tula, where he had witnessed less experienced marksmen die because they shifted too quickly. He remained still until the barrage ceased. When the Germans advanced again, he resumed firing. This time, he targeted a German NCO who was directing squad from a shallow ditch near the center of the field. One shot ended his efforts. A second shot disabled a sniper attempting to counter Koval. A third struck an ammunition runner whose fall caused entire squads to suffer shortages. Each hit slowed the German pace further. But the Germans were relentless. Their training, discipline, and sense of necessity drove them onward. They understood the ridge needed to fall for their counteroffensive to succeed. They pressed forward with grim determination. By midday, their assault shifted from methodical to desperate. They could not locate the sniper. They could not silence him. They could only continue advancing under the constant threat of unseen death. Koval's influence expanded with each passing hour. His presence forced the Germans to abandon coordinated formations. Squads broke apart. Communications faltered. Officers hesitated, knowing any visible command gesture could be their last. What should have been a swift capture turned into a grueling crawl. Meanwhile, the Soviets behind the ridge strengthened their positions. They dug deeper. They redistributed ammunition. They braced for the moment when the Germans finally closed in, because they knew they eventually would. No sniper, regardless of skill, could halt an entire assault alone. But halting was not the goal. Delaying was. The longer the Germans remained pinned in the field, the less effective their armored support became. Tanks without infantry were vulnerable. Infantry without armor were exposed. Disorganized assaults drained German momentum. Momentum was everything. As the afternoon shadows lengthened over the snow, the Germans prepared their largest push yet. They assembled multiple companies along a broad front. Panzer IVs rolled forward, engines growing louder. The final push had begun. From his vantage point, Koval wiped frost from his scope. He could feel the shift in the air, the moment when battles turned from controlled engagements to chaotic survival. He adjusted his aim. The next phase would define everything. By late afternoon, the field beneath the ridge resembled a battlefield carved into frozen earth. Snow churned black and brown where tank tracks had passed. Craters from mortar shells pocked the landscape like deep bruises. Smoke trails drifted in slow curls, carried by wind that sliced across the plain. Shadows lengthened, stretching far over the ground as the sun dipped behind distant clouds. The Germans assembled for their largest push yet, one that would determine whether the ridge stood or fell before night. Panzer IVs rolled forward first, advancing in a staggered line. Their armor glistened beneath frost, each tank coated in soot where Soviet rifle fire had glanced uselessly from its plates. The tanks moved with deliberate force, engines rumbling deep and constant. Their commanders remained buttoned inside. Koval had ensured no hatch remained open long. Behind the tanks marched infantry companies. Dozens of German soldiers advanced with rifles raised, spacing widened, posture tense. Their earlier confidence had diminished. Every man knew the threat hiding somewhere on the ridge, watching them through a scope. They scanned the tree line constantly, though they had yet to glimpse even a hint of movement. Machine gun teams positioned themselves behind the broader assault line, preparing to lay suppressive fire across the ridge once the tanks closed in. Mortar crews adjusted firing angles. Radio operators relayed updates urgently, their messages clipped and precise. This was no longer a measured push. It was a final attempt. For the Soviets, the tension tightening along the ridge felt physical, like the earth itself held its breath. Lieutenant Vasyukovka crouched behind a snow-packed mound, scanning the tanks through binoculars. His men lined the trenches with rifles ready. Their faces were pale, frostbitten, but determined. Their ammunition was limited, their numbers thin. Their strength relied on timing and the ability to remain calm under pressure. And above them, hidden beneath frost-coated branches, Koval waited. The sniper had been motionless for hours. His fingers were stiff inside mittens. His joints ached from lying prone in the cold. But exhaustion did not matter. The rifle remained steady. His breathing remained controlled. His thoughts remained clear. The Germans advanced in the pattern he had expected. Tanks in the lead, infantry behind, officers toward the center, communicating movements through gesture and brief radio calls. Machine gun teams preparing to support the moment the tanks neared the ridge. Koval had studied such assaults before. At Tula, at Bryansk, near Mozhaysk, German doctrine was adaptable, but not invincible. A weak point always emerged. And now, as he swept his scope across the battlefield, he found it. The left flank advanced faster than the right. The tanks there had pushed slightly ahead, creating a separation between armor and infantry. The officers responsible for that sector gestured urgently, trying to realign the formation. That one gap, barely 15 meters, was enough. Koval exhaled slowly, then fired. The shot traveled across frozen air and struck a German platoon leader, raising his arm to direct movement. The man fell instantly. Confusion rippled down the left flank like a fracture through glass. Infantry hesitated. The tank slowed, unsure of the infantry's placement. Koval fired again. A second officer collapsed. The left flank stalled, but the Germans responded with aggression. The right flank surged forward to compensate. Machine gun teams set up their weapons and opened fire in long, punishing bursts aimed at the ridge. The air filled with tracer lines streaking upward. Snow erupted along Soviet positions as bullets tore trenches apart. The Soviets crouched low. Dirt and ice rained upon them. Some flinched as bullets passed inches overhead. A few buried their faces into the freezing ground, praying for the barrage to cease. Koval remained still, waiting for the momentary break between bursts. He knew machine gunners often paused to adjust belts, cool barrels, or reposition their lines of fire. He watched through his scope. There, one brief pause. He fired. The machine gun loader dropped immediately. The gunner froze in shock, turned instinctively toward the fallen man, and exposed his head for a fraction of a second. Koval fired again. The MG-34 fell silent. But the Germans had dozens more. Two additional machine gun teams opened fire from new positions, spraying the ridge with relentless bursts. The battlefield roared with overlapping gunfire. Snow plumes burst in constant rhythm. Splintered wood flew from shattered trees. The Soviets gripped their weapons tighter, teeth clenched, hearts pounding. The tanks moved closer. The lead Panzer IV advanced to within 200 meters of the ridge. Its turret rotated slowly, aiming toward the Soviet trenches. Its cannon thundered, sending a shell exploding along the ridge. Snow and earth erupted upward in a geyser of frozen debris. Another explosion followed, then another. The ridge shook beneath the bombardment. Koval's nest absorbed the shock, snow cascading off the branches overhead. He could feel the vibration beneath him, a deep, resonant rumble that traveled through the earth and into his bones. He waited for the next opportunity. Each tank shot revealed subtle vulnerabilities. Tanks were hardest to stop, but they relied on crews making decisions. Crews needed information, and information came from one place: commanders. A tank without a commander became slow, confused, hesitant. Koval scanned the nearest panzer. The commander remained inside, wise after watching several officers fall earlier. The gunner was rotating the turret, trying to locate Soviet firing positions. The driver adjusted speed, swerving slightly to avoid anti-tank obstacles buried under the snow. The commander remained hidden. Koval waited for something else. And then it happened. A second tank veered too far right, its track striking a buried tree stump concealed beneath snow. The Panzer jolted violently. The turret rocked. The commander instinctively opened the hatch to check damage. A fatal habit. Koval fired. The commander fell back inside the turret. The tank froze mid-maneuver. The gunner inside shouted new commands to compensate, but without leadership, timing faltered. The tank stalled. Koval shifted targets. A German squad hurried toward a shallow depression offering partial cover. They moved quickly, rifles raised. One man carried a machine gun tripod. Another hauled ammunition belts. Koval struck the gunner, then the assistant, then the ammunition carrier. 3 shots, 3 impacts. The squad collapsed. The Germans concentrated fire toward the ridge. Mortars exploded along the crest. Artillery thundered from distant positions. Machine guns raked trenches with unbroken fire. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Vasyukovka's platoon returned fire, measured, disciplined, conserving ammunition. They did not waste rounds at distant shadows. They shot only when German infantry came into effective range. Their restraint mattered. Their timing mattered. Their survival depended on both. Still, the Germans pushed on, driven by orders and momentum. The center thrust advanced closer, using the remaining tanks as mobile shields. Snow churned beneath their boots. Steam rose from their heavy breaths. The final assault approached the ridge. At 90 meters, Soviet rifles opened fire. At 80 meters, German rifles responded. At 70 meters, casualties mounted on both sides. At 60 meters, grenades began to arc through the air. Explosions shook the ridge. Shrapnel sliced through clothing and skin. Smoke gathered in dense patches. The battlefield narrowed to mere meters of visibility. German infantry pressed forward, seeking to overwhelm the trenches with sheer proximity. Their shouts melded with the roar of gunfire. A tank shell exploded near the outer trench, throwing 2 Soviet riflemen aside, their bodies tumbling through the snow. Still, the Soviets held. Koval recentered his rifle. His pulse slowed despite the roar around him. The world narrowed to scope, breath, trigger. He scanned for the next threat, the one that could break the line. He found it. A German squad, larger than the rest, was advancing along a shallow ravine that led directly to the weakest point in the Soviet trenches. They moved with confidence, believing the depression concealed their approach. It almost did, but Koval saw their helmets briefly reflect light as they passed a gap in the snow-curtained mist. He fired. The lead soldier fell. He fired again. A second collapsed. A third shot struck the man carrying grenades, detonating them prematurely in a flash of fire and snow. The ravine filled with smoke. The squad disintegrated. The Germans tried again and again, but each attempt met the same fate. The tanks, now dangerously close to the ridge, attempted to provide suppressive fire at near point-blank range. One Panzer rolled over a mine the Soviets had buried days earlier. The blast tore its right track apart, sending it skidding sideways, immobilized. The crew inside panicked. Another opportunity. Koval shot the tank's gunner as he attempted to evacuate. Then he shot the radio operator. The remaining crew sealed themselves inside, unwilling to risk exposure. The immobilized tank became a shield and a trap. By late afternoon, the German assault had lost its cohesion. Their companies had suffered heavy losses. Officers lay scattered across the snow. Machine gun teams were exhausted. Tanks remained operational but disorganized, unable to advance without infantry support. The ridge remained intact. Koval had fired more than 50 rounds. Nearly all found targets. His precision had turned the field into a graveyard of halted momentum. The German assault, planned with discipline, executed with determination, had been shaped, slowed, and ultimately blunted by one man controlling the battlefield from an unseen vantage point. The final German push collapsed as daylight began to fade. Soldiers retreated in clusters, dragging wounded comrades through snow. Tanks reversed slowly, smoke trailing from exhausts, engines growling in frustration. The ridge belonged to the Soviets. Lieutenant Vasyukovka's men, exhausted, frostbitten, but alive, watched as the final German elements withdrew. They exhaled in relief. Their bodies trembled with cold and adrenaline. They had survived a battle that should have overrun them in minutes. The Americans, observing from a distant grove, wrote their final notes. They recorded casualty numbers, enemy movements, and topographical changes. But their most striking entry was simple. One Soviet sniper halted the assault. As evening settled, the ridge fell quiet. Smoke rose from burnt vehicles. Snow drifted over fallen men. The wind carried the faint sound of retreating engines. Above it all, hidden beneath frost-covered branches, Koval lowered his rifle. The climax had passed. The ridge held. The assault had failed. And one man had changed the course of an entire engagement. Night settled slowly over the ridge. The last embers of daylight faded behind distant clouds, leaving the sky a deep, muted gray. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting silently over the battlefield, covering the traces of struggle, softening the harsh outlines of shattered trees and scattered debris. As darkness grew, the wind quieted. The chaos that had thundered across the frozen slope only hours earlier faded into stillness. The ridge, once trembling beneath artillery fire, now felt suspended in time. Soviet soldiers moved along their trenches in weary motions, checking for wounded, gathering abandoned rifles, reinforcing positions with numb hands. Their exhaustion weighed heavier than their gear. They had fought through the entire day, clinging to the ridge against an assault that should have swept them away. Lieutenant Vasilyev stood among them, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of a flickering lantern. His uniform was torn and covered in frost. Lines of fatigue marked his face, but his eyes remained focused, scanning the field below, ensuring the Germans had fully withdrawn. Only after several long minutes did he allow himself to exhale slowly, releasing a tension held since dawn. The ridge was quiet. It had survived, and though the Soviets had fought courageously, they understood the truth of what had unfolded. The survival of the ridge had not been the work of a platoon or even of a company. It had been shaped, defined by the steady, deliberate actions of a single marksman whose rifle had dictated the rhythm of battle. Senior Sergeant Ivan Koval remained in his concealed nest long after the last German soldier had disappeared from view. He did not reveal his position immediately. He listened. He watched. He waited for any sign that the Germans might attempt a renewed assault under cover of darkness. Only when he felt certain the field had fallen silent did he begin to move. He rose slowly, as if emerging from the landscape itself. Snow slipped from his coat. Frost cracked around his hood. His joints stiffened from hours of unbroken stillness. He brushed the snow from his rifle with careful, methodical motion. Each movement appeared practiced, ritualistic, even shaped by years of experience. When he stepped out into the open, the Soviet soldiers along the ridge turned toward him. They said nothing. They did not need to. Their expressions reflected a simple truth. They understood what he had done. They grasped how close they had come to collapse, how narrow the margin between survival and destruction had been. Their relief carried a weight that silence captured more fully than words ever could. Koval moved past them, heading calmly toward the interior of the Soviet positions. He passed through rows of exhausted men who straightened as he approached. Some nodded faintly. Others stared with quiet awe. Koval acknowledged none of it. He simply carried his rifle, stepped across the snow, and descended into a small dugout where officers awaited a report. Inside the dugout, a map lay spread across a wooden crate. Oil lanterns cast uneven light over its surface. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. Vasilyev and several NCOs stood waiting, their faces solemn. They listened as Koval provided a clear, precise account of the day's events. Targets engaged, movements observed, timing of each German push, patterns in their strategy. His tone remained calm, almost detached, as though recounting a routine patrol rather than a single-handed effort that had shaped the outcome of an entire engagement. When he finished, the officers exchanged glances. Vasilyev stepped forward and silently placed a gloved hand on Koval's shoulder, a gesture rare among officers hardened by years of war. It was enough. Outside, the snowfall thickened. The ridge grew brighter under the reflected light of a moon hidden behind clouds. Silence settled more deeply over the trenches. The Soviets secured their arms, reinforced their positions, and prepared for the possibility of renewed fighting in the morning. But for the moment, the battlefield belonged to them. Throughout the night, distant engines echoed faintly from the German lines, vehicles repositioning, wounded being evacuated, officers reorganizing battered companies. The Germans had not anticipated such losses. Their assault had been designed to shatter the Soviet line. Instead, they had been forced to withdraw, leaving dozens of men and multiple armored vehicles scattered across the field. They would regroup. They would return. But the day belonged to the defenders. Far to the west, near a cluster of frost-covered pines, the American observers packed their field equipment. Their notes were exhaustive, pages filled with detailed observations of German company movements, Soviet defensive patterns, and the precise moments when momentum shifted. Yet one section of their report contained no numbers. It held no diagrams. It recorded no troop positions. Instead, it contained a single line. Sniper activity decisive. Unidentified Soviet marksmen prevented consolidation of German assault. Effect comparable to full platoon. Later, when the report reached headquarters, senior officers would review it with interest. And though they could not know the sniper's name from that distance, they understood that the Eastern Front produced individuals whose skill rivaled that of any marksman in the world. The night wore on. The ridge remained quiet. At dawn, the snow-covered field told its story in silence. German bodies lay where they had fallen, their weapons half buried beneath a new layer of snow. Tanks stood motionless, their surfaces glazed with frost. The footprints of retreating infantry formed long, meandering trails leading back toward German lines. The ridge bore scars of its own, trenches collapsed by detonations, shattered trees leaning at unnatural angles, earth churned by explosions. But it remained in Soviet hands. Koval returned to his position at first light. He moved without hesitation, stepping into his nest with practiced ease. He brushed away the thin veil of snow that had accumulated overnight, cleared his rifle's action, and resumed his place with the same calm discipline that had defined him the previous day. The Germans did not attack that morning. Their forces had been too disrupted. Officers lost, formations broken, tanks immobilized, morale damaged. Their survivors spent the early hours retrieving wounded men and regrouping behind the shelter of distant woods. Their inability to advance had created an unexpected delay whose consequences rippled beyond the small ridge outside Vasyukovka. For the Red Army, the delay proved decisive. Soviet reinforcements, delayed by snow-choked roads and logistical bottlenecks, arrived shortly after sunrise. Fresh rifles, machine guns, and mortar crews spread across the ridge. Trucks delivered ammunition crates. Engineers reinforced the trenches. The line stabilized. What had been a fragile perimeter held by cold, hungry, exhausted men evolved into a fortified defensive position capable of withstanding continued pressure. The ridge would not fall. Later, military historians would describe the engagement as a minor action in the broader context of the Eastern Front. It did not decide the war. It did not alter the movement of entire armies. But for those who stood on that ridge, and for those who studied the day's events with careful scrutiny, it represented something important. It revealed how the actions of a single individual could shape the momentum of battle, even when facing overwhelming force. Koval's contribution could not be measured solely in the number of enemies eliminated. It was measured in hours gained, in momentum disrupted, in confusion sown within German ranks at critical moments. It was measured in the survival of the ridge itself, and the stability it provided to a sector of the front that desperately needed time to reorganize. The Americans who observed the battle never forgot what they had witnessed. Their reports circulated among Allied intelligence units. Questions arose about the identity of the marksman whose precision had halted an entire assault. But the front moved quickly. The war moved faster. Names blurred. Events overlapped. And in the chaotic months that followed, the identity of the sniper faded into the vast tapestry of Eastern Front history. Yet among the Soviet soldiers who defended the ridge, his name never faded. They spoke of him as the calm figure who remained steady in the most violent moment of the battle. The man who lay beneath frost-covered branches from dawn until dusk, shaping the battlefield with deliberate precision. The marksman whose rifle halted tanks, silenced officers, and disrupted waves of infantry. Years later, when veterans gathered in modest halls and quiet meeting rooms across the Soviet Union, they spoke of many battles. They recounted countless hardships. They remembered comrades lost and moments of fear they had buried deep within memory. But when they spoke of the ridge above Vasyukovka, their voices carried a particular reverence. They remembered the day when 12 exhausted soldiers held against a German assault that should have crushed them. They remembered the frozen trenches, the thunder of tanks, the blinding explosions along the crest. And they remembered the sniper whose steady hand had transformed the battlefield. History often records vast offensives, encirclements, breakthroughs, decisive battles spanning hundreds of miles. But history is also shaped by moments few witness. Moments when a ridge becomes a hinge upon which an entire sector turns. Moments when a single rifle, fired with discipline and clarity, influences the survival of dozens. Moments when one man holds the line. The ridge at Vasyukovka eventually fell silent again. Snow melted in the spring. Birch leaves returned. Grass grew over the trenches. Farmers reclaimed fields that had once echoed with the thunder of war. Children walked the road once more. But beneath the soil lay the memory of a day when the world narrowed to a scope's crosshairs, a breath held steady, and the weight of a battlefield resting in the hands of one marksman. And long after the war ended, long after medals were awarded and histories were written, the ridge remained a quiet testament to a simple truth. Courage does not always shout. Sometimes it lies hidden beneath branches, breathing slowly, shaping the fate of many through the calm precision of one steady hand.